Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first Cultivating Collaboration Network webinar of 2022. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all those who have registered. Our theme of decarbonisation on farm is a priority for our agri-co-ops. It's a theme that is as broad as it is challenging, and one which requires assessing both the art of the possible now and predicting what technical approaches will emerge in the future. Shaping this landscape for investment decisions and identifying what underpinning policy needs to be in place to accelerate the adoption of relevant thinking and solutions also needs to be considered. The presentations you'll hear today are only the start of the conversations that will evolve through the C2 network. My name is Helen Glass and I'm delighted to be your host today. We have just over 100 delegates joining us at our webinar, representing over 76 organisations from across the UK farming landscape, including 12 agri-co-ops and a range of research institutes, technical enterprises, economic development and funding bodies. And this really does reflect the cross-sector and multifaceted stakeholder community that needs to be involved to bring new thinking to drive change in the journey to decarbonisation, whether it be bespoke to the livestock, arable or service co-ops, or for the wider impact across the rural landscape and supply chains. This has been called the decade of change. By working collaboratively across our farming landscape and through our agri-co-ops, we believe that decarbonisation journeys can achieve the scale of change that is required. Agri-co-ops, like many businesses in the agricultural and other sectors, are already on that pathway, and our webinar today will provide a starting point to further develop their strategic roadmaps towards their carbon reduction goals. The C2 network provides a facilitated and an interactive space which enables external organisations like yourselves to exchange ideas and explore practical approaches to prioritise challenges with our SAOS agri-co-op membership. To start our webinar today, we have Tim Bailey, Chief Executive of SAOS, to provide a welcome to you all and to outline a vision approach to decarbonisation in farming. I'll ask Jamie to play Tim's video.
Good morning and welcome to our first C2 Network webinar of 2022 that looks at the critical topic of decarbonisation. We cannot underestimate the importance of our collective journey to net zero in agriculture, and never has the opportunity for collaborative working with co-ops been stronger. Whether it's bringing in cross-sector skills or new thinking, decarbonisation is an activity, a deliverable that we need to accelerate over the next decade, not only for the environment, but for business and supply chain resilience too. The recent very sad events in Ukraine have demonstrated that more than ever. If, like me, you've been following C2 Network on LinkedIn, you'll be aware of the many strategies and reports from within and external to agriculture that demonstrates that our direction of travel is decarbonisation, and it's not a question of if, but a question of how and when. Agriculture is already making great progress in that decarbonisation journey, with a host of farming practices being adopted and ambitious projects and ongoing innovative technologies being developed. Whether inspired through engineering, precision agriculture, livestock genetics, right through to energy production and storage on farm, it's all steps in the right direction of travel that combines new thinking and knowledge together with skills to deliver the outcomes that enables agriculture to transition to a decarbonised economy. So where do agri-co-ops come into this? Well, our agri-co-op members have been one of the best kept secrets in Scottish farming, and their successes, their leadership, their contribution has often been understated. Yet the SAOS agri-co-ops are the powerhouse of Scottish agriculture, working in all sectors with a collective turnover of £1.5 billion each year, representing 30% of total agricultural output. They represent anywhere from 20 to 50% market share per sector. Our 60 agri-co-ops are at the core of the C2 network, and consequently C2N is an ideal platform to not just talk about change, but deliver it. The reality is we can't make the change needed to tackle decarbonisation at an individual farm level. To use an Olympic mantra, we need to go higher, faster and stronger. We need to scale up that thinking so that agri-co-ops can be the drivers of that transition and extend it into the rural communities they serve. Can this vision be achieved in Scotland? Is there a policy framework in place to make this happen? Is there the appetite to link up with the expertise across our UK universities, innovation centres and energy sectors to make this happen? How can we secure the investment to drive these bold projects forward? Can co-ops be at the heart of the roadmap that leads not only to the farm of the future, but the future farm network that anchors its supply chain in the most decarbonised food production system possible? We might not answer all these questions today, nor will we reach our collective destination in the short term, but we will start the cross-sector conversations and provide the framework for that vital engagement. SAOS is delighted that our 3 speakers today will address topics from collaborative decarbonisation, the status and potential for green hydrogen being part of the future mix, and the framing of a co-op decarbonisation challenge. And together with our panel of experts, we anticipate that this is just the start of exciting opportunities for our sector. I very much hope you enjoyed today's event and hope you'll join us on this journey.
Thank you, Tim. We have 3 keynote speakers today, and during each presentation, please post in the Q&A box any questions you have, and we will pose as many as we can in the panel session at the end of the webinar. Please use the chat function to introduce yourself to other delegates, but if we keep the questions in the Q&A box, it's easier for us to locate them. As Tim just said, our trio of keynotes presentations are just the start of conversations that will lead to more action-orientated activities in the weeks ahead for the C2 network. Our speakers have never appeared on the same platform before, and I'm certain that their expertise, their track records will ignite discussions today, as well as inspire the roundtable conversations that will take place in the weeks after this webinar. Let's go straight to our first presentation from Peter Murphy from UK Water and Power, who I know will give us a glimpse of what the future might look like from a landscape perspective, and will focus on using circular economy principles to address a decarbonisation outlook. I'll ask Jamie to play Peter's video.
Good morning, my name is Peter Murphy of UK Water and Power. UK Water are a small consultancy involved in assisting clients of all types, from large water companies, large industrial companies, food, agribusiness, drinks companies, develop a decarbonisation strategy. We're involved in water, wastewater, organics, waste products and data, asset data from all of the above. That helps these companies develop a strategy to ensure energy efficiency and include decarbonisation in their overall methodology. And these projects are very real, multi-million-pound projects, some of which are world-leading projects, bringing both confirmed technology to the opportunity and also innovative technologies such as biochar and pyrolysis to such opportunities. So today we're going to present to you, this will take about 15 minutes. We want to outlay our first story, which is part of the decarbonisation strategy, as to a baseline, where you are today. So we'll talk about the situation that most industry in agriculture particularly finds themselves in today. And then we'll talk about the art of the possible, what we can do very quickly with investment and possibly co-investment and funding. And then we'll talk about the future, how we can develop that even further to decarbonise so that any investment is not stranded in the next available financial period. So looking forward to discussing this with everybody, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, SAOS, Patty and Helen, and to the C2 Network for asking our opinions on decarbonisation. It's much appreciated. This slide that you're looking at now, our current situation, that's basically where everybody is. So we're used a traffic light system, and that traffic light system is currently at red because it's not acceptable to continue with the practices that we see. But I guess if we go back in time to 1960, this system would have been green lights because we didn't know what we know now. And in 2022, it's clearly red. So with climate change, data, fossil energy effects, energy price rise, further costs and production pressures, we find that the situation is very different from when we developed this ideology. So looking at this slide now, we can see the sun drives so much of the processes that we have in protein production and in cereal production and farming in general. Weather plays a major part. So at the top end of the slide, we've got some snow in the hills, and we've got some clouds in the sky, and some rain, and some sun, and some trees, and lots of water. And that brings the environment together to create the situation where we're able to have food production in our country, which is a huge mainstay, and I don't need to tell you guys all of that, of sustaining our population in a given land space. So we're very fortunate that we have all of you good people able to do what you're able to do and produce this fantastic food and the food ingredients that we have in this country. So on the slide, we've got some animals, we've got some sheep in the hills, and we've got some mixed farming there, but we've got some cows, we've got some power coming in, we've got the farmhouse, we've got some grain silos, we've got the tractor there and some cereal production, we've got surface water runoff, we've got a bit of forestry and land, some wetland and forestry land nearby bordering the farms, which is absolutely atypical of the mixed land use scenario for agriculture that we'll have in this country. So we've managed to slot in in this case, maybe a chicken rearing shed, but we've got it as a specific company, Tweedies. Anybody that knows the backstory to that, I'm sure they'll have a laugh. But we've got Tweedies pork and chicks, and we've got a few free range, and we've got maybe a processing centre or a shed. It's not really that important. It's all about intensity of farming and production of wastes. And so a lot of those things, going back to the traffic light system, you can see the fuel use. If you go to the processing centre or the tractor, you can see that the emissions are carbon heavy. There's lots of emissions coming out of there, both in carbon and in terms of other noxious materials, whether it's particulate matter or gases. We can't continue to burn fossil fuels in this way because it is leading to global climate change. And then we have the manures. So it used to be they would be put in the slurry pit and reused as fertiliser, quite rightly. It's a great bioeconomy story. At the moment, we've got major issues with that as sizes of production, sizes of farms increase. Dairy farms were small units, now much larger units for economies of scale, and so on and so forth. So we've got much more slurry, we've got much more intensity, we've got higher rainfall events, climate change is coming into play, and you've got surface water runoff. So managing fertiliser production or manure, spreading on farms and going into environments, creating issues and algal blooms and certain times of the year, and so on and so forth. That's a red light, and it's something that we all are aware of and we all need to manage. And then we've got crop residues, so, the old practices of burning them or doing something else with animal feed, get all of those things. But I think there's an awful lot more valorisation we can look at, both in the supply chain, because the supply chain, everything we grow has come at a cost, and the more we can valorise that locally, the better the opportunity is going to be to reduce your costs by valorising the material, both in energy and potentially in additional fertiliser use in the future. And it's no coincidence that all these things on the red traffic light system here are inextricably linked. And then potentially you've got some grants that may come from forestry and soil or peatland restoration. And so there's some real opportunities there to take some of those residues and enhance both the peatlands or forestry, as it may be, depending on what's applicable. And then in the soil itself that maybe you're using or others or a cooperative or a collaborative can benefit from. And we'll talk in detail about those, but you already do some of those things, ploughing material into the soil. Then there's the no-till debate, which takes us neatly on to the big story, which is CO2. So we're all going to be asked by your suppliers. So if you're supplying food industry, they're going to want to know the carbon footprint of what they're buying from you. They themselves are going to be requested to give their carbon footprint to the product that they're manufacturing. And then the supermarkets themselves are going to be asked by the consumer to give us some advice on the carbon footprint of the whole supply chain of the products that they supply. So that whole system all uses fuel, it all uses energy, it all creates gases, whether it's methane or whether it's CO2 and other greenhouse gases. There's a real story of collaboration to be told here, how we can work together to change that. And at the end of the chain, I guess that's where the consumer is. So the consumer is going to be asking, how do we develop a much lower carbon footprint for the products that we're buying, and whether that's directly from the farm or directly from retail outlets or the big supermarkets that we all know and love. So that's the scenario currently. Moving on to the opportunity now for decarbonisation, what we could do quickly and with some investment and co-investment and hopefully some collaborative funding. This slide 2, is the opportunity that presents itself to change the current situation. And many of you, I'm sure, will already start to look at how you change your water, your waste, your energy to make a difference economically to begin with, because that's the big one. It's look at my bills. How much am I spending on materials? So taking the same methodology, traffic light methodology that we looked at, we're going to run round the slide. So now when we look at it, the good old Mother Earth, the environment, is still very much the same, although it's very clear to us that with global warming, temperatures are changing, and therefore that does change the environment. So we may have warmer days, and we may have more sunlight, we may have rainfall at different periods of the year, and we may have much higher rainfall events at some periods, which will cause flooding and surface water runoff, and therefore change the environment. So that changing environment is what this is all about. How do we play our part in mitigating some of that? So up in the hill, it's clear to see. We've got some energy, so we've got some land in cooperatives and farms, and where possible, in this scenario, we can have wind turbines, we can have solar, we can also have green hydrogen electrolyzers in the future, and some of those are starting to happen already in small scale trials. So I decided to keep it in here because it's very much on the horizon. It's coming, and it may be small scale to begin with, but very interesting with biogas. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And clearly, we can make biogas, we can mix hydrogen, we can have even MFC, which is microbial fuel cells, and we can use algae to create all sorts of interesting additional revenue schemes. But again, that would be the future, and it's small scale, and I know several at the moment that's working with AD plants and with farmers to produce lipid fats and protein for all sorts of added value revenue streams. Early stage technology, but something that's definitely here and something that's we should put on everybody's horizon. So the sheep ain't changed much. They're pretty lucky. They're out there doing the same old thing that they're always doing. That's a great example of stoicism in farming. You're maybe not going to be an oligarch with having sheep, but at the end of the day, it's a very good use of that particular type of land that we all know. So moving on to maybe cereal production, we've got the fertiliser cycle, and we all know the cost. It's expensive, but maybe there's an opportunity here by by a different process to reduce fertiliser use, get it nearer the crop root ball, and maybe have less water in certain areas where there's not so much rainfall over that time, too much one period, too little another, and maybe we can retain some water with materials such as biochar, which can be made from crop residues. So there's a really interesting cycle of efficiency here of material residue. How do we valorise that material to the best of our ability? And we can even be running a tractor on biogas and other fuels. And that's going to be happening in the future. Biogas will mix with hydrogen and we can create a much cleaner fuel that maybe you've even produced locally to use for machinery rings and your own machinery. So very, very interesting opportunity that will develop. And hopefully if we can develop this story, the environment, the water environment, surface water drainage there, you can see it next to the tractor, all of those things may be a different scenario. The methane from the cows, well, biochar actually reduces methane quite considerably. That can be reduced considerably. We can take the manure, valorise that and turn that into biochar. So that's a virtuous cycle potentially that can absorb carbon and lock the carbon down, and that carbon can be accounted for in the chain in supplying the consumers that the cooperatives or other agricultural entities will be supplying. So the biogas, it's quite clear we can make that from the litter and the manures and the crop residues. That can run combined heat and power. It can go as biogas to the grid. We can make biofuels to run the machines or create the energy in the CHP, as we said earlier. We can take the digestate and that can be spread on the land, or we can pyrolyse that to biochar to add in the carbon story. So what is the best value? And we at UK Water do a lot of that. We add up the story. But essentially what it does, it greens Tweedy's Co-op in their pork and chicks and their agricultural activities. So you can have a lot less carbon in the product that you're selling to your supply chain, be it the independent retailers or the supermarkets. And the consumer is going to be very, very interested to know exactly what's happening in that regard. So now when we look at the fuel, that's amber turning to green. The manures and the fertiliser is changed with the crop residue by technology intervention. That's now turning amber to green. The peatlands, the soil and the forestry are now, can be enhanced with this value chain, and therefore the environment can too. So that's turning amber to green. And CO2 you've reduced maybe 50, 60, 70%, depending on how much hydrogen we have in the mix. So it's a very, very interesting and changing picture. We've now come to our last slide. So now things are changing enormously. We've added the hydrogen into the story. Fertiliser is changed completely. We're now looking at being able to confirm the data science and the cereal crop production. We've reduced the methane in the cows with active interventions of biochar and other enzymes and all sorts of stories. We've got real pyrolysis working on confirmed carbon, the fuel, the manure, the crop, the peat, the soil, and the CO2 is reduced 70 or more %. So it's only by working together and collaborating can we actually achieve these ends. So the art of the possible in the future is much more collaboration. Thank you. I really appreciate you listening.
That was a great presentation to start with, Peter. Building a scenario against a traffic light perspective is very apt as for direction of travel. And Peter also highlighted the inextricable link between decarbonisation on farm and supply chains. He made so many touch points on decarbonisation. I'm sure you'll have questions to pose, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. As Tim said, agri-cooperatives are at the heart of the C2 network, and our next presentation is from Murray Forsyth, who has recently become director of Aberdeen Grain and has a background in oil and gas. I can't think of a better way to frame the considerations that co-ops face when they have to prioritise their decarbonisation journey and challenges. For those of you unfamiliar with agri-co-ops, Murray's presentation will also provide an insight into just one of around 60 co-op members of SAOS, all of whom have common as well as bespoke decarbonisation priorities. I'll ask Jamie to now play Murray's video.
Hello, this is a short presentation to explain and frame out where we see the emissions reduction challenge at Aberdeen Grain. I'm Murray Forsyth and I'm a non-executive director at Aberdeen Grain. It's a co-op in Aberdeenshire where we've got approximately 150 members, and we receive, condition, store and market the grain on behalf of the members, hopefully trying to get the prices for them. But I'm also the managing partner at Smiddyburn Farms. It's a 1,000-acre mixed farm in Aberdeenshire. Our enterprises are arable, beef and lamb finishing. And also for the past 30 years I've been a chartered mechanical engineer in the aerospace and oil and gas sectors, and more latterly I manage several carbon abatement projects. So across these three areas I've got experience on the carbon emissions challenge, and I'd like to share some of that with you today. So where do we see ourselves now? I think most people would say they appear bombarded with information about the emissions reduction challenge and global warming, and certainly COP26 created a lot of that last year across the UK as a whole, but more particularly in Scotland. And as a result of that, I think the UK is trying to take a leading role in climate change and is trying to legislate and be a world leader for this. I think generally within the public there's a consensus that we need to do something. They can see the effects of global warming, and so they feel that we need to do something to reduce our emissions. There is probably some scepticism out there, especially when I look at the targets of what we need to achieve and what we've done so far. I would say that there's some scepticism about how realistic that challenge is going to be. And some people may say, you know, why should we be doing a little work and perhaps suffer, if you like, if there's going to be financial elements to this, if you've got large polluters like India and China that are doing much less than us. But there is synergies with efficiency improvements in this. So if we do reduce our emissions, that usually means that for a large part we're reducing our energy use, and so that reduces our costs and makes us more efficient operationally. But I think there will be a limit to the improvements that we can do with that, and to get ultimately to net zero we may have to start doing things which actually cost our business, and that's going to be where a difficulty will come in, especially when we are representing a co-op and we're representing the members and their investment facility. We need to make sure that every pound we spend is done with their interests in mind. Where do we want to get to? I think Paris Agreement agreed that we need to get to net zero by 2050, and different organisations and governments have perhaps set more ambitious targets for 2040 or 2045. Certainly the Scottish whisky industry through the Scottish Whisky Association have committed to be net zero by 2040, so that's kind of ahead of the game. There doesn't appear to be any legislation at the moment for small companies or farmers. There certainly is for large businesses who have to report it as part of their accounting process. But perhaps we can anticipate that in future there will be some legislation that pushes us to do some work to improve our sustainability and efficiency. Certainly in the farming sector, I would anticipate that any reform in the agricultural policy and any subsidies that we get in future will be some linkage to sustainability improvements and carbon reduction. But I think more importantly, there's an increase in demand from the consumers and from customers for low carbon produce, and that's just reflective of the increase in awareness that the consumers have about global warming, and so they are looking for low carbon produce. So we have an opportunity here that if we're ahead of the game, we can make ourselves the produce of choice. So once we have an idea of where it is we're trying to get to, the next question obviously is how we're going to get there. And this is where the engineering comes out, and I would say the first step is to understand what your existing carbon footprint is. And I certainly took advantage of some government support to get the carbon footprint for my farm calculated so that I know where I am. But every business is different. Each business consumes energy in different ways and it has different emissions. So it can be difficult to compare them. And how do you compare them? Are you looking at emissions reduction or absolute emissions? Because if there's any support for this, anybody that's already spent money to reduce their emissions may feel that they've not got that support and other people do. And then how do you express it? Is it relative to your pounds, million pounds of turnover, or is it kilograms of output? Certainly the farm output shows it in kilograms of barley or kilograms of beef, but they're obviously quite different in how they're made. So it's difficult to compare them. For Aberdeen Grain, more particularly, is where is the boundary and who owns the emissions, especially considering that all the members actually own the grain. So Aberdeen Grain never actually owned the grain. It belongs to the farmer, and you could argue that the production of that grain until it gets to the merchant belongs to the farmer. So you probably need some clarity around that. Ultimately, we're going to need to have standardised methods of calculating this so that there is a comparison across businesses and that people are not penalised unnecessarily. And also, if you don't ask people to calculate the carbon footprint consistently, or if there's any support for this, then you risk driving their own behaviours and that people will just focus on doing something that makes the calculator look better, when in actual fact there should be something else that is more effective for reducing emissions. So when should we start addressing this challenge? Should we be proactive? There's a benefit in that we can perhaps get ahead of the game and exploit any opportunities that may bring. But there is a risk that you may be doing something that is down the wrong path and you end up spending money which you don't see the anticipated return for. We can be reactive. That's obviously good in terms of cash flow and that you're delaying any spend. But you do risk being marginalised. If consumers are looking for low carbon produce and you're late to the game, then you can end up being out of favour and lose business that way. I certainly at the very least would like to be progressive in this, and I think understanding your footprint and what your options to reduce your footprint are, so that when there is more clarity around what we should be doing and what each business is required to do, then you have the solutions at hand and you can deploy them and you know which ones are going to give you the best return. But who's going to pay? Obviously I've mentioned about quite a lot of solutions here about reducing your energy use, and that reduces your energy cost and improves your operational efficiency. And they're going to be obvious winners, albeit in quite a number of cases you may have to invest some money up front, and that can put a strain on finances. So certainly like Aberdeen Grain, that can be where it's difficult when you're spending the members' money, if you like. I think small businesses are going to need specialist support to help us navigate their way through this in terms of calculating the carbon footprint and also advice on the solutions that we should introduce. But more concerning is really the final push to net zero. I think often the last elements of that can be economically negative. And when you're in an industry that already effectively relies on subsidy support, it's going to be difficult to spend that additional money getting down to net zero. So there needs to be a compelling reason for doing that. So just to kind of summarise a little bit, in the idea of sharing where we see this at Aberdeen Grain is to identify where we think there is help going to be needed or would be appreciated. I think first and foremost, having some expertise to advise us in what needs to be done and certainly to analyse the footprint is going to be appreciated. There are certain businesses out there, and this is kind of where it started for us, that we were looking to get our footprint assessed, but the quotes that we got for it weren't insignificant. So I just wanted to be sure that we were choosing the right organisations. We're probably going to need some assistance in terms of the solutions, so they can be quite widespread, and there's going to need to be some quality decision making to make sure that you're going to pick the ones that reduce your footprint economically and don't cause you any operational problems at a later date. So some advice on what these solutions are and how to implement them is going to be useful. I think having representation would be very useful if we can share our experiences and if there's common threads, and we need some support for this, certainly at a government level. I think it would be useful to have representation through perhaps SAOS to help us with that and make sure our voice is heard, and make sure that if there is any support at a government level coming from this, that it is going to be useful to us. Guidance, so in terms of navigating through this minefield, if you like, it would be useful to get some expertise guidance on the best roadmap for our business. So what should we be doing and when? So some assistance that way would be useful. Finance is the obvious one. If somebody were to pay for it all, it would be very much appreciated. But perhaps even just help with the cost of financing for short periods of introducing any change into our business is going to be pretty useful. I think collaboration is going to be key, and I think we should all be looking to share our ideas and share what problems we see and see if we can help one another. Because a solution in one business might be useful in another. So talking to different businesses, and like I say, that's why I'm here today, is to try and share where I see Aberdeen Grain and see if there's any synergy with other businesses. I think leadership is going to be important in this, in certainly trying to take the initiative maybe at the right time. There's probably going to need to innovate here as well, and those that do take a leading role in this are probably the ones that are going to thrive. Certainly if you can view this as an opportunity rather than a risk, then you're more likely to succeed through this. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Murray. I sense that your perspective is also going to be reflective of our broad co-op membership, and it gives sight of a common framework that has to be navigated on co-op decarbonisation journeys. So from Peter's view of integrated technology solutions and a traffic light-based progression approach, together with Murray's foresighting view from a co-op perspective, we can now turn to our third and final speaker, who's going to address the topic of green hydrogen, the good, the bad and the reality, which I'm sure is going to be a conversation starter in the Q&A session. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. Kerry-Ann Adamson has worked in the hydrogen sector for 23 years, and she focuses on supporting her clients to create investor-ready projects which combine the necessary ingredients of innovation, safety, and fiscal awareness. There's no one better to give us an honest appraisal of this trending topic in news channels. Is it as easy and accessible as we hear about? Could it be part of the mix that Peter spoke about? Over to Kerry-Ann's presentation.
Good morning. So my name is Kerry-Ann, and I'm here to talk about hydrogen. But instead of showing you PowerPoint slides and looking at pretty pictures, it's 15 minutes. I just want you to listen, to sit back and listen to what we want to talk about. And at the end of it, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. So for the next 15 minutes, I want to talk to you about the emerging industry of hydrogen. Now, there's two key words in that already. One is emerging and one is hydrogen. So first of all, what is hydrogen? Now, you have to be living in a cave on Iona at the minute not to have heard that hydrogen is the next booming industry. Depending on who you listen to, it's going to be worth $1 trillion in the not too distant future. The reality is, though, that the hydrogen industry, and for the rest of this talk, when I talk about hydrogen, I mean hydrogen that is the low carbon or zero carbon, is incredibly immature. we're at least 10 years behind the wind industry, at least 10 years behind the wind industry. So when we talk about hydrogen, please don't go away thinking, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, please do not go away thinking it's something that's plug and play today. Hydrogen is an energy carrier. It has to be produced. It is not something that sits around waiting to be collected. So in one way, it has to be farmed. This means that it is produced from something else and used in something else. Now, when I say that, and I mean that in the broadest sense, because we don't have any clear, legally appointed definitions of those production pathways. A lot of people you will hear or you will read about hydrogen colors, right? So green hydrogen is the one that a lot of people have heard about. Green hydrogen, now remember this is not legally defined, is hydrogen that is produced from renewable energy plus water, not tap water, demineralized water, through what is called an electrolyzer, which is basically a box that sits there, and it produces hydrogen. The hydrogen that comes out the other end, depending on what flavor of box you want, is either compressed, so it's at high pressure, or it is at atmospheric pressure. Now, green hydrogen is, remember this, from renewable energy. So it's important to understand, if you are really interested in this, that electrolytic hydrogen, which is any type of electricity going through the electrolyzer. So there are some people talking about nuclear power, for example. This tends to be called pink hydrogen, and there are some people who use grid electricity. The other one you probably will have heard of, or possibly will have heard of, is blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is hydrogen that is produced from natural gas, and then has the carbon stripped out of it either at some point on the process and stored. Now, I actually caught myself there because as a techie, I do tend to go down rabbit holes of technology, and that's not the point of what I want to talk about today. So I apologize at any point if I do end up wandering off like that. I can't help myself. Now, the kicker in all of this is because we're all based in the United Kingdom, which is not the kicker in itself, but because we're based in the United Kingdom, hydrogen colours tend not to be meaningful. Now, I say this because Westminster, the UK government, and at the minute, the Scottish government and the Welsh Assembly have all agreed they're going to use carbon intensity. So instead of talking about colours, they're talking about the carbon intensity of hydrogen production. That means from the fuel itself plus the water through whatever production process to the end. Now, if you're talking obviously about winter hydrogen, just winter hydrogen, it's a very low carbon, around zero carbon hydrogen production process. So when you are talking about hydrogen, the first thing to remember is always, one, you have to produce it, but two, in the UK, we talk about carbon intensity. So if you are looking to produce hydrogen, you will need some form of carbon accounting system. This is not off the shelf either. You cannot go down to Sainsbury's or Waitrose or wherever and go, I'll have one of your lovely carbon accounting systems, please. They don't exist. These are very much, it's a new industry, it's nascent. These are being developed as we speak, okay? So again, I'm going to repeat this. It's a very immature industry. If you wanted low carbon or zero carbon hydrogen, you cannot call up a distributor at the minute and order it. You can't say call up Bock or Air Liquide and say, could I have a tanker full of your lovely zero carbon hydrogen, please? That doesn't exist. Not only doesn't exist because it's not certified, so we don't have the red tractor symbol in any of this yet. I use the red tractor a lot because it's a symbol that is recognized across the UK as organic, it is recognized as high quality, and it is people that something can trust. We are a long way for having this from hydrogen. It's something that we absolutely need, absolutely need. We need the equivalent of the red tractor for hydrogen. So you can't call up a distributor and order it. What you can do though, is a bunch of, as the farming industry, is actually start to produce it. Now, I know this because I've been having discussions with farmers for a long time about hydrogen. Now, I appreciate this next statement is a gross generalization and in no way an insult. But what tends to happen is farmers will come up to me and say they would like to start producing hydrogen on their farm. And I go, that's fantastic, well done. You know, real trailblazer, well done you. So if we start off cheap, and that's where the conversation gets derailed. Hydrogen projects and hydrogen at the minute and hydrogen technology is fairly bespoke. Bespoke means expensive. There is no such thing as cheap in this industry. Now, I should have stressed, and I should have stressed it at the start, and I apologize. I talk about hydrogen, not HHO, which is a different system, a different technology, and will not in any size, shape, or form be touched in this presentation. So when I talk about hydrogen, it's the bigger systems, okay? And these are not cheap. And usually at this point, the farmer in question will go, oh, well, that's grand, that's lovely, and I'll talk to you again in a decade, eh? And it's fine, because anything you want to do in the hydrogen industry, please do not think you are coming in to a standardized industry where you can pick up cheap units or even economic units and run them. Any hydrogen project at the minute really is predicated on public sector funding. We are seeing the start of subsidies put in, and we're likely to get contracts of difference in the UK. We are likely to get these contracts of difference for hydrogen in the UK in around 2024. But obviously you can even hear the weasel words in what I'm saying. Now, if you are still not put off by doing this, there are two options for farms. The first is the farming of hydrogen itself. Any farm with wind turbines or solar or even potentially biomass could produce hydrogen on site and sell it. This is a super nascent market, super early, but it's not to say it's impossible. What you have to think about though is to say, where are you interested in drawing the line? Are you wanting to lease the land to have the hydrogen production site put on it by somebody else? That's probably the simplest route if you are. Then it's not your problem, your rent is coming from the lease of the land. If though you want to do the next step and you want to produce the hydrogen, if you have a wind turbine, for example, and it's grid connected, if you sell that power to the grid, you will have to go back through your contracts with a fine tooth and comb to find out if you were allowed to use those electrons for any other production process. There are some, I believe, some contracts that do allow that, but that is not the main. So in theory, it is not simple just to disconnect from the grid and start producing hydrogen, because hydrogen is probably worth more to you at the minute than electricity going to the grid. Probably. Go through your contract, get a lawyer, get a good lawyer to have a look at your contract if that's something you're interested in doing. The next thing, say, please do not go onto Alibaba and buy these systems. This industry, the hydrogen industry, is the antithesis of keep it simple, stupid. This is a specialized industry that we have to keep specialists for safety purposes. It is not me making a pitch for expensive engineering services. It is me saying we have to do this properly to make sure that the number of accidents are minimized. So please do not try and do this yourself. Work with a technology firm or a technology integrator. Now, if this presentation in 2 years' time, hopefully we'll do a rerun, we might be able to tell you something a bit more simplistic and encouraging on that. Watch this space. So again, work with an integrator firm who will look after that for you. And then now you've produced the hydrogen. What are you going to do with it? Well, you need to store it on site to start with. And the storage units will have to be set in certain areas. There are lots of regulations around how you store hydrogen on site. You are then going to sell it. So the equivalent of a milk truck would have to come down into the farm to collect the hydrogen. That industry does not yet exist. That industry of a milk round to come and collect the hydrogen doesn't exist. If anybody's interested in business opportunities, by the way, there you go. But it is not there yet. So you will also then have to work out how you sell and move your hydrogen off your property. So as you can see, hopefully by now, the point what I was saying before about the easiest thing to do is to lease the land to project developers. That really is what I would recommend. Now, the second option is that you're wanting to use hydrogen on the farm itself. Farms are great microcosms of industry, of heavy industry, of everything you could imagine. And there are a number of possibilities to use the hydrogen that you produce on site. There are some companies that are starting to deploy in very small batches, I mean onesies and twosies, okay, hydrogen tractors. This is not new, by the way. Anybody says this is new doesn't know the history of this industry. The very first hydrogen tractor was released in the 1950s. And there's a fabulous, unbelievably sexist photograph now of the gentleman's secretary in a miniskirt driving this tractor. It is a snapshot of almost a different world, but that it's not new. So Deere tractors, for example, John Deere, they're looking at this, and you will start to see hydrogen tractors come to market in the not too distant, again, 1 or 2 or 3 years time. They're not going to be cheap. Let's be honest, they are not going to be cheap. They will have a premium over and above what you already see as an expensive piece of technology. The other option is you can retrofit your tractor. If you're interested in that, again, work with specialists. Please don't go away and try and do it yourself. But you can do, there are companies now looking at vehicle retrofitting. So you've got all your farm vehicles that a number of companies are looking at producing hydrogen versions of, or the retrofitting option. Now, the second one is heat or hydrogen in the home. Again, and I will have to keep repeating this because it is not a non-trivial issue, is the issue of safety. A number of organisations in the UK are looking at retrofitting homes so that they're pumped directly with hydrogen. Anybody old enough to remember Towns Gas will remember Towns Gas was a mixture of natural gas and hydrogen in the UK. This is not the same. Okay, this is pure hydrogen we are talking about here. Pure hydrogen into the home to actually power and heat the home. There is a long way between here today and having that happen as standard. From everything from you have to make sure your saucepan is hydrogen compatible because hydrogen burns at a different temperature, to how does that impact the insurance of your property, the value of your property, can you get a mortgage on that property if your farmhouse is still mortgaged. All of these issues, which are non-technical, have to be sorted out yet. So again, whilst it is an interesting area, it is one for research and development, and one you can absolutely keep up to date on in the R&D papers, but not one to play around with on the farm, and certainly not one to try at the minute. The third one is in a boiler. So a lot of people, again, a lot of organizations are looking at developing hydrogen ready boilers or hydrogen ready CHP units or turbines or whatever whatever you're interested in. I apologize if people are listening to this and she keeps saying it's in the future, it's in the future, it's in the future. Well, guess what? This is in the future as well. So, in fact, but this is one of the areas where it's a lot closer term. So we are seeing some companies that have developed hydrogen engines and hydrogen CHP units that are either on the market now or will be in the next year or so. So that is certainly something you could potentially look at. The final option is using the heat for drying. So especially in things like biomass drying, if you farm that on your farm, hydrogen systems give off very little waste heat. So depending on what type of box you procure, you either get what is a medium temperature unit or a low temperature unit. The waste heat that comes off these is minimal. It can be pumped into a drying shed, but you certainly, the economic value of that is minimal because of the quantities. I would say though, now this is a real potential positive, is that with electrolytic hydrogen, so if the box you are using is an electrolyzer, it does produce a lot of oxygen, pure oxygen. Now, most people today have focused very much on the economic value and the production of the hydrogen. But what we are starting to see is people come forward and going, oh, that oxygen, that's quite cool. Can I have some of that oxygen, please? Because especially in the soft fruit industry, pumping pure oxygen into greenhouses has been shown to promote growth and accelerated development of soft fruit, things like tomatoes. So if you do have greenhouses on your property, or if it is your business, potentially that is another economic route. And when you start stacking these values, so selling the hydrogen, using the oxygen, increased promotion of growth, that starts to make project economics slightly different. But as you can see, all this is bespoke to your farm, all this is bespoke to the project in question. None of this is off the shelf. None of this is something you can just go and order at the minute. I would say, please come back in 2 years' time, and hopefully we might have some better news for you at that point. But at the minute, this is about the whole industry is bespoke. So we are aware that a lot of you are really interested in hydrogen, and that is fantastic because it gives people like me an opportunity to speak. And it is a really interesting area, and it is evolving very, very rapidly. What we need in Scotland now, though, is a demonstrator farm so we can actually go and show people around, can touch and feel and all that good stuff. And what we need is to be able to design a glide path from the bespoke to the standardized. And that is what a number of us are working on. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has been interesting to you, and I hope that I haven't depressed you too much or made you think this is not worth it. But what I want to have done is saying this is a placeholder for the next year, 2 years, 3 years. You will start to be able to do a lot more with this. If you're at all interested, please just reach out. I'm more than happy to speak to anybody, answer questions, or talk to Helen, and she has my contact details as well. All right, thank you very, very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerry-Ann, for such a direct and relaxed approach to the subject of green hydrogen. We should point out to all our delegates that a handout based on your conversation will be sent out to all the delegates after this webinar. So again, reviewing this webinar at your own leisure, you'll be able to hear again the depth and breadth of the conversations that have been had already this morning. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Alan Stevenson to chair the panel session.
Okay, good morning everybody, and thanks to Helen and thanks to the presenters today. Some fascinating presentations there that we can now get some feedback on. But first of all, I should say joining our speakers are two panelists who will be, I'm sure, well recognised by many of our delegates. Our own Robert Logan from SAOS, who's a co-op specialist and has his finger on the pulse when it comes to co-op climate change mitigation strategies. And we also have Andy Kerr, who is Director for UK and Ireland at Climate-KIC, Europe's largest public-private innovation partnership for climate action. And some of you may certainly know him as a former Executive Director of the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. So just to give our presenters a little rest, with Robert. And thinking, Robert, and thinking a bit of Peter's traffic lights in his diagram, it showed a high level of concern across all areas, fuel, manure, etc. And really, from the farming perspective, do you see a similar picture? Is it the same across all sectors? And I think most importantly, how can agri-co-ops contribute to being part of the solution to this efficiency and climate challenge? So hopefully you got all that, Robert. I think you might be on mute.
Thanks, Alan. That's a big question to start, folks. So yeah, no, academics rightly would ponder the question of sustainability as one of the wicked challenges, and it's something I've been kind of speaking about recently, about the problem of many hands. And we're all collectively responsible, but individually we're not responsible. There's nothing we can, materially do to change it individually to have a significant impact, but collectively we can. And the problem is that once we get past the low-hanging fruit, of doing, you know, small tweaks and changes on farm, as you know, for this audience, or on you know, for at a landscape level, it gets progressively more difficult, and the next interventions become progressively more capital intensive, or require a greater number of people to cooperate and collaborate together. And I think that's where cooperation comes into its own, and that you get a group of individuals with a shared objective who coalesce around an idea, and they take it forward because they take ownership of the idea, or of the problem, of the challenge. I think that's where co-ops have been tremendously successful in the past. And looking forward, you know, we quite often talk about, you know, how co-ops are part of that solution, and how they can look at mitigating market risk. They can take on a particular challenge that they collectively have and share. They can access new markets and premiumization, hopefully, and, you know, so they can look at sustainability in different ways. But maybe we should flip that, and we talk about the positives, but maybe we should flip that and also talk about what happens if we don't, you know, and that's maybe the bigger shocking factor, is if we don't do that, you change the mindset. Because if we all close our eyes, for those that are not farmers in the room, if we all close our eyes and think about ourselves as individual farmers, and the challenges of lots of different stakeholders that demanding different things from that land manager, meanwhile they're also trying to make a living from an inherently low margin activity that is long hours, and it's also the family home. So you've got a serious pressure there. So if we don't do something slightly differently, if we don't help farmers to cooperate together and formally cooperate, more importantly, I think in a lot of cases, you create if you change the attitude from how much can we do to make our lives better, to everybody's talking at me rather than talking with me. And you change the mindset from proactive to reactive, and say, well, how little can I do just to survive? You know, just to do what the minimum need to do to tick the box. I think that's where cooperation really comes into its own.
Okay, no, thanks, Robert. That's great. And I'm just going back to Peter there, just to kind of complete this point. And Peter, you certainly identified opportunities around biogas and valorization, crop residues and manure, perhaps other income streams or other ways of managing efficiency within farm. Can you see ways of how we could achieve this quicker, bigger, faster? And I guess some farmers will certainly be interested in, without giving exact figures, but what kind of investment are we talking here? If you could give us some thoughts on that, Peter, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I guess for me, the collaboration story is everything. So a co-op, by its very design, is designed to collaborate together. So you're getting that economy of scale out of something. But I think Murray made a really good point, and there's an awful lot to be looked at here in terms of policy. So how do we get the Scottish Government and other interested parties to bring all of this together? So as Murray made the point, it's really interesting that the producers have the grain, and yet the cooperative is the one who's finding the price and moving it forward. So how would you, if you could use biochar, for example, in crop residue to reduce the carbon footprint of that, who actually gets the benefit? Is it the cooperative or is it the producer? And at the moment it's the producer. So that's probably not a bad thing, but actually how does that work for the cooperative? So there is so much to be looked at here in terms of measuring and getting the metrics right from the start. And I think to do that, we really do need to have good leadership. We need to get Scottish Government together, get the ministers together, and say, right, how are we going to do that? How are we going to achieve this? Anybody looking at their fuel bills, my phone's ringing off the hook at the moment, because people's energy bills in the food business and in the drinks business and in general, industry in general, are doubling and trebling at the moment. And there's no relief for this. This is going to continue. So without investment, that's the real story here. We need to invest. But where's that money coming from? Murray made a really good point. Who's going to pay for this? So, and if you're going to pay for it, what's the return on investment? Kerry-Ann made really good points about where and how much hydrogen putting it on the farm, but actually at what price point? How much is it going to be to make it worthwhile? So I guess my answer to your question is really, how do we get government to listen to the story? So let's tell the story. The story is really simple in my mind. I like to simplify everything. So the bills are there. Let's all look at the bills and where are they going to be in the next 6 months and in the next year? And then let's model that whole story together. Let's make sure the technologies are there. In answer to your question, Alan, about cost, it's millions of pounds. So if you know, it's all about that. How many tons is going to give me a payback over what amount of time? I'll give you some ideas from the other industries. Whisky industry, if you're putting an AD plant in for the whisky industry, the return on investment period was 7 years. That's just dropped to under 3 years. So that gives you a real insight into how this has changed. And that was because they wanted to do it because of the carbon, but now they have to do it because of the economics. And so that return on investment period is less than half.
Sure.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great answer. And it's good to get that realistic perspective on it, and seeing it as investment, much as for some might see it as a cost, but we've got to look to the future in a different way. And we know there's always two sides of that coin. So I'm going to bring Andy Kerr in here, and Murray, some of your points seem to be quite quite pertinent, and I guess because you're speaking for the co-ops. But I think that this risk of taking the wrong path, because there's so many things you can do, and I guess it's ensuring how do we get the policy right, and how do we get the support right, and what's the best way in which centres of research and innovation can engage and help within that kind of whole parameter.
Okay, thanks, Alan. So I guess our experience, and we're a sort of pan-European innovation partnership. So we use public money, we use private money, and traditionally what we did was support early stage businesses to bring new solutions, bring new products and services to meet the demands that Peter was talking about in terms of the specific technologies, or that Murray was talking about in terms of some of the challenges. But actually what we found over a number of years, nearly a decade of doing this, was that the speed and scale of the change that is expected of the sectors, the agri-food sector, other sectors, is such that actually bringing forward individual solutions, bringing forward individual actions isn't sufficient to deliver the change that we require. And so what we've actually shifted our work to work much more broadly across the whole sector, so right the way down the value chain, to work out what are the levers, what are the potential intervention points that we could support change across the whole system. And that can be everything from, Peter talked about the government, so regulation and policy. Yes, absolutely. But we can't rely on that. It also has to be around the skills and capabilities across the sector. It has to be about making new markets. We need thriving businesses. That means we have to have something we're selling into. That in itself could be around alternative proteins. It could be around the new carbon markets. It can be around, there's a whole range of new markets that are emerging. And the question then is, how do we capture the value so that the cooperatives and the farmers are capturing that value properly and seeing the return on investment? But it also is a really big one, is that access to finance and investment. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is, there is no shortage of money out there. There are huge funds in institutional investors looking for a home at the moment. The problem they have is that the scale between what they're looking for and an individual farm is completely the wrong, it's a wrong set of scales. And so actually a lot of what we're trying to do is, how do you aggregate up potential solutions that actually have a similar risk profile, so that actually institutional investors can come in and start to essentially scale solutions across multiple players. And that's where the co-ops become really powerful, because actually you've got farms with a similar set of issues, and you can start to scale solutions across a much wider place. So there are ways in which we're doing it, but you do need to look at new financial models to make that work. And again, that's something that needs to be a bilateral conversation between the cooperatives and the investors to see what happens. and that involves blending public money as well, because as Peter said, we are talking about a subsidy, or I think Murray said we are talking about a heavy subsidy here as well. So you're going to have to find something that matches public and private. So I think those are the sorts of things that we're seeing at the moment in that space.
Well, that's really helpful. So again, we're not addressing any of these things, like environment and carbon challenges in isolation. It's really got to be wrapped into the whole business approach for the future. So I just wanted to ask Murray, just your thoughts on that as a co-op, Murray. How do you feel about how challenging that is to bring farmers together in this way and look at other opportunities for income business streams to help your members?
Yeah. I think what struck me is that, listening to the presentations, is what we're talking about here is, complex systems and processes which are not core business to the co-op. Now, if I look at our co-op, it's a fairly simple co-op. We bring grain into the store, we dry it, we store it, and we sell it. But even doing that's got its challenges to get everyone on the same page. We're just doing something as simple as handling grain. If we then start talking about introducing a whole bolt-on business on the side with the grand idea that it's going to reduce the carbon footprint, it's a separate business, and you're going to have to partner really with specialists to do that. But being a relatively simple co-op, we don't really have the expertise to understand who to partner with. Now, Aberdeen Grain did install a biomass system in the last 10 years, and I think it was a time when fuel prices were high, but then fuel prices dropped, and so the biomass, hasn't probably been as good as it would have originally anticipated, whereas now maybe it's going to come into its own when the fuel prices come back up. So we have done something, but that was very much a core part of the business, was drying grain, and what can we do to reduce the cost of ownership of that. But when we start talking about going into hydrogen systems and so on, and the kind of complexities that have been raised, that's going to be hard, I think, to do. Again, I've got a foot in both camps here, in the sense that, having been in the oil industry, in seeing how much effort goes into designing these systems, and the cost that's associated with that, it's just on a different scale to what any simple farmer co-op can do. So that just listening to the presentation today, there just seems to be a big gap between what we're trying to do, what we need to do, and I think Andy kind of highlighted it, that needs to be done on a grander scale.
Exactly, yeah, and that's, hopefully that'll be part of the purpose of our project going forward as a C2 network, giving people that chance to bring these things together and discuss it. And I'm going to come on to hydrogen in a minute, Kerry, and one question I wanted to ask Robert quickly, certainly from Murray's presentation. There's around 10 to 14 different ways of measuring carbon. So how do we settle on what's the best way, or is there international standards that can provide that for us, that schemes can comply with? What's the answers, Robert, to that easy question?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Well, there's a series of calculators, certainly at farm level, that have been certified. So they've been approved, so they're following IPCC modelling. But you can have the same calculation, and it still can generate slightly different results because of the way they've asked the question. And that's typically where the farming community, and we all start to get a bit frustrated, because you'll get a different answer depending on the footprint, the carbon model that you put the information into, simply because of the way it's asked the question. So the units of measurement are slightly different, or the way it's quantifying a particular piece of the equation. And so I mean, at the moment, that can get frustrating. But I think in the short term, what we need to do is, if you get your calculator of choice, and then you use that over and over again over time, then at least you get a demonstrating a trend, and you can see where whether the information is absolutely accurate or not is secondary, but what you can see is the general area of greatest emissions, and you can start to think about what you can do about them. It's back to that 80-20 rule of trying to do as much as you can with doesn't need to be 100% accurate to get a really good kind of gut feel of what you need to do next.
Yeah. Okay, no, thanks for that. And a colourful question here. Just want to ask Andy this one, and then we'll come on to hydrogen. Andy, this is about the other part of the carbon side, and this is carbon sequestration, which is obviously really important, and particularly important for agriculture. How are we dealing with that, and how can we ensure we measure and monitor it in the right way?
So, and I'm just reading Simon's question in the chat, which picks that up. I'm not sure I agree exactly with what he said, but certainly his point that the way in which we're measuring things at the moment around the products, but we're missing the wider sequestration that happens on the farms, completely misses the opportunity there for farms and farmers. And so the way in which we measure the overall carbon impact of farms is something that we need to address, because at the moment a lot of the public goods, the value is not being captured within the measurement system. So I think that is something that does need to be addressed going forward. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say we do have a carbon positive project that is sponsored also by Scottish Government. So we'll share details of that, because that's something that's progressing and may help in this area. Amongst everything, but as you can see, everything has to be a kind of rounded solution if we're going to capture all this. So moving on to Kerry-Ann, who's been sitting very patiently in terms of hydrogen. A couple of questions to come in, Kerry, and some of them similar. Example, James Hutton Institute has a lead in a project called Hydrogen. It's a feasibility study focused on development of renewable hydrogen powered farm energy. And I think there's another one with the Eden project that St Andrews University is connected to as well. I just wondered, have you come across more of these demonstrations facilities in global agriculture? And also, is there examples of co-ops that are perhaps been engaging in some of these particular projects in Europe or elsewhere?
Okay, thank you. First of all, it's Kerry-Ann, it is never Kerry, okay? Okay.
Oh, yeah, Kerry-Ann, I'll mute myself.
So thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. First of all, before I hit those questions, there's some comments I want to pick up on that Andy and Murray have made. Murray, the cooperative model that you outlined there, I think is so much fantastic opportunity to expand and as Andy touched on, combine cooperatives to go for these new financing models that are coming out from the carbon markets. And if nothing else that comes out of this, I will be getting in touch with you afterwards, because you just sparked so many ideas in my head as to what we could do. But there are so many opportunities for cooperatives to grow for their and bring in extra resources to stop this kind of need to do it every single time at individual scale. I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. And Andy, I couldn't agree more with so many points that you made about alternative financing models and the amount of capital that is now waiting to be deployed into any sector that has to decarbonize, as long as it's got a clear regulatory framework around it. We tend to blame governments in the UK quite rightly for a lot of failings, right? We do. It's a standby that we all go, oh, it's the government's fault. But the reality is that the job of government is to set the overall direction of travel. And as long as we work within that regulatory framework, we have now so much potential to go ahead and do things. As to what the role of cooperatives could be in this, just listening to you guys, literally listening to you guys, you can, you know, there are ways of aggregating carbon credits to the gentleman's, I'm assuming it's a gentleman's comment in the panel about the role of government and is it, you know, stuff. There are so many ways that we could start aggregating carbon emissions, creating carbon sink databases, right? Because I think that's what he's talking about. And trading co-ops could actually hold carbon credits, right? Could potentially hold the carbon credits for their cooperatives, for their farms. And from the oil and gas industry, come on, man, that's a challenge you must be salivating at. In terms of hydrogen specifically, aggregating hydrogen production at farm level and becoming a swing supplier to say the likes of Aberdeen, right? So Aberdeen's going after hydrogen in transport. They are crying out for hydrogen, right? So becoming a swing supplier or a top-off supplier for something like that. There are a lot of business models that are not massively outside the scope of what is being done at the minute in farming. It's all about, well, I appreciate appetite for risk. It's all about, as Andy said, business models where we deploy alternative finance. And alongside that, what part of my industry needs to do is set the safety standards to do this. So I appreciate that's a very roundabout answer, Alan, but there you go.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kerry-Ann. We know what a challenge this is, but I was wondering, is it possible to put a sort of date how far away we are from this starting to become more of a normality, or is it still too early to say?
The ideal scenario is that hydrogen is boring, right? That you shouldn't get excited about it. It should just be normal. My eldest saw a hydrogen bus. I live north of Inverness. She saw a hydrogen bus the other day and I got excited. She got embarrassed because I was excited about a bus, right? So teenagers. And it shouldn't be that we get excited about this. It really shouldn't. It should just be a normal part of the fuel mix. How far away from that? Well, you know, we're a bunch of crusty old so-and-sos and we're going to get excited because we're part of the change. But the next generation down in 20 years' time, when my stepkids get on the hydrogen ferry to the Hebrides or drive the hydrogen tractor, they're not going to think about it. They're not going to think about it. It's just completely normal to them. Whether they drive an electric car or a fuel cell car powered by hydrogen, it could be as quick as 20 years. And that's literally, if we've got the skills, that's something I've talked to Helen about, like the skill sets needed for this are tremendous and not being brought through. So universities and Andrews and groups certainly have a role to play.
Okay, great. Well, we'll get something to go at then. And I guess, you know, this is another part of the opportunity of the C2 network, because part of it is to bring to attention what is happening out there, what we can address in the future. And I think we have already quite a few areas that we can look at and set up groups to discuss and then see where that can be brought forward. Some of it, I think, is a lot of it will be connecting up, which is what we do. And I think in this case sounds very much what is needed, and taking that very sort of big approach to this. It's more than just one thing. It's really bringing the whole business infrastructure together on this, as well as capturing all these benefits and advantages. That's the end of the questions, and I'd like to thank everybody for their inputs. Much appreciate that, and I think as well, thanks again to the presenters. They've done a fantastic job. I will now hand you back to Helen, who will summarise and finish off for the day.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think that Q&A session has been so valuable in some of the take-home messages, and we will be capturing any questions that haven't been able to be answered in that session, and we'll get responses from our speakers to these questions. So the vision of C2N is to bring about new thinking to strategic challenges that face agriculture, and to ensure that the sector continues to play its part in our food security, in our economy, in our contribution to net zero. And through the C2 network, we have the potential to harness the overall co-op network to support not just each other in reaching decarbonisation objectives, but the rural communities in which they operate. And I think the presentations and the Q&A session pays tribute to that. Now that you have experienced our first C2N webinar, we need to ensure that our momentum around decarbonisation and your engagement with the C2 network today progresses to the next phase. A single webinar cannot do justice to the topic of decarbonisation on farm, nor can it highlight all the associated challenges that our co-ops face. And that's why today is the start of the conversations. The presentations this morning, together with the panel sessions, has given plenty of scope for more detailed and bespoke conversations to take place in the coming weeks. And the ideas generated, the views put forward by our speakers, and the reflections from the panel sessions will be captured. The C2 network is not prescriptive about the outcomes that can be achieved from the facilitated discussions that are now going to take place. And that in part is due to the longitudinal timelines that Tim alluded to in his presentation. Going forward, it could be an activity that will lead to a collaborative proposal for a wide range of R&D calls. It could be devising a skills-related programme. It could be a series of learning journeys to demonstration facilities or research centres that are undertaking the cutting-edge research thinking. And as highlighted in the Q&A session, it'd be looking at the financial models that surround this. And it could also be working with our stakeholders to influence policy and funding, but we need you in the audience today to join us at that virtual table with our cooperatives. So if your business or organisation operates in this landscape, then your expertise, thinking and influence all has a part to play as we dig deeper into the specific opportunities and challenges. And we need you to join in these deeper engagement dialogues and in the development of the proposals at the scale required. So after this webinar, we're going to be sending you, the delegates, from our C2 network email address an invite to answer four key questions, which will enable us to coordinate a series of round-tabled themed discussions, which will be facilitated by one of my SAOS colleagues. Those of you who indicate in your response that you want to continue into this next phase will then be contacted to continue your journey with us through the C2 network. And I truly believe and hope that most of you will want to do that. In the meantime, make sure you're connected to us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter, where you'll find details of our other 2022 planned events. On behalf of the C2 network, I would like to thank our speakers for their insight that was delivered through captivating presentations, to our panelists for contributing to the discussion, and to Jamie from SBN, who has ensured smooth technical delivery of the webinar, and to you, our audience, for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to keeping in touch with you all, and have a good day.